So why look at this? Well, unfortunately, I've noticed that there's a lot of misnomers or stereotypes about this relationship between religion or the church and science, that somehow they have to be butting heads, or that they can't work together, that science contradicts religion and religion can't work with God, and they obviously, with science, and they obviously disagree. And really nothing could be further from the truth, at least from a Catholic theology perspective. Really, on one end, if we look at the church's history, there is a rich history of different individuals using science to not only discover who God is, but really to develop Western civilization. Sure, there were bumps in the road. You'll probably find someone who always referenced Galileo, but even then, that was a situation that was highly politicized, and in and of itself, that the church has even come in the 20th century to regard that wasn't handled the best way. So yes, even though that there are bumps in the road, it doesn't take away the fact that science and religion can work together, and that science can be a means that we can actually discover more about the world around us, and by virtue of that, discover more about God. So let's look at it. So here are some quotes to that end. So we all know Albert Einstein, who was considered the father of modern physics. He says, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." Very blunt words. Francis Collins, who was a physician and a geneticist, so looked at genetics, he says, "One of the greatest tragedies of our time is this impression that has been created that science and religion have to be at war." I really hope we can dispel that myth. Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, hopefully we know, the father of physics before Einstein. He says, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." So he's really referring to Aquinas' idea of the intelligent designer. And lastly, Joseph Houghton Taylor, he won a Nobel Prize in physics. He says, "A scientific discoverer is also a religious discoverer. There's no conflict between science and religion. Our knowledge of God is made larger with every discovery we make about the world." And that's really, I think, Taylor's words is really what I want to focus in, is the idea of using how we can understand, quantify, measure the world as a way to understand the divine. So in this way, science and reason are really tools to understand who God is. If we kind of look at a little bit of history, Western civilization really grew out of a sense of both the church's efforts to grow society and its efforts to grow science. So when science really started to develop in the Eastern world, when we think of the origins of the Ottoman Empire in Babylon, India, China, part of their religions saw the world as circular. So if we look at the Hindu religion of reincarnation, this world will grow and then transpire and then pass away. So the desire to want to measure this world, at least at that time by those mathematician scientists, wasn't great, because this world was just going to eventually pass away. It took science coming to Western civilization with its Judeo-Christian values that saw the existence as linear. There's a beginning, and then there's an end, and then there's a great beyond, to say, all right, this is the only life we have, this is the only world we have, so let's understand it because it's the only one we got. And from this, science really took a hold in the Western civilization of let's understand and quantify and measure and understand this world around us. Some of Europe's first and well-known scientists, physicists, mathematicians, as we're going to see, were Catholics and part of the Catholic Church. In part because Catholicism in the Catholic Church was the to-do in the Western world, right, wrong, or indifferent, with all its ups and downs. But on the other end, because they saw this to be true, that if God made all of existence and God left his mark, then if we can understand existence in the world around us, then we can understand God. And if we actually look at the first university systems that actually came out of the first cathedral schools and monasteries, the first majors, if you will, that were taught in these schools were theology, law, and medicine. So really at the very beginning, this idea of science and medicine and theology were taught in tandem, were taught at the same time. So let's look at some of these players, just a couple. I encourage you to search. There are so many more individuals in church history that have lent to this idea of reason and science. But let's just look at a couple of them here and how they try to approach existence to learn about God so we can learn from them. So first I want to talk about is St. Bonaventure. He was a Franciscan friar. That's what the abbreviation OFM means Order of Friars Minor, which is the official name of the Franciscans, a religious community started by St. Francis of Assisi. and he later on became a bishop in the 1200s. One of his most famous works was A Soul's Journey to God, where he talks about the different kind of levels or areas or states of mind or being that a person can go through to ascend to and eventually reach and know God. And at the very grassroots of his ascending order is the idea of creation. And he talks about, say, of vestiges or windows, that creation is a window through which we can see God. So by studying creation, by measuring creation, by looking at creation, we can see something of God. We talk about Roger Bacon. Siena College, which is where I actually did my undergraduate studies, they have their science and math building is Roger Bacon Hall, named after the Franciscan friar, mathematician, and philosopher Roger Bacon. Similar to Aquinas, who brought Aristotle's philosophical method to Europe, Roger Bacon was famous for bringing Aristotle's scientific method and really popularizing the scientific method of forming hypothesis, testing, having different variables, coming to a conclusion, and retesting. So in one way, Roger Bacon brought the scientific method, Aquinas brought the scholastic method, and together they encourage this idea of measuring, of inquiring, of inquiry, of really looking into the world around us to understand, well, what can we discover, and what can we discover about God? So asking questions is a good thing. Let's look at a couple more individuals. So Gregor Mendel, OSA, means he was part of the order of St. Augustine, who we talked about very briefly in the very first module. He was an Augustinian monk. He was a botanist working with different plant life and physicist, and really he laid the groundwork for genetics. His most famous work was in measuring and looking at the genes and genomes behind peas, of all things. And in that, looking at the intricacy of existence, the intricacy of genetics, and saying, okay, there has to be some intelligent design at play. So he's a great example of being able to use genetics and even the sciences to undiscover the intricacy of the world and pointing to the idea of intelligent designer. Father George Lemaitre. Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of Father George Lemaitre, but he's actually one of the most important individuals to modern day science without us even knowing. I don't know if you've ever watched the show on TV, The Big Bang Theory. A lot of us may have heard of the Big Bang Theory and know the Big Bang Theory to be one of the most prevailing theories of how existence came into be. That ultimately the universe emerged from this hot, dense state and expanded and expanded and expanded, and we see this growth and movement of creation, and from this comes the planets and material. Well, Father George Lemaitre, who was a priest, is who came up with this theory, and the idea of the Big Bang Theory was actually a term that scientists at the time used to actually mock his theory. It wasn't originally called the Big Bang Theory because they didn't really think it was that good, but now it's actually one of the most prevailing theories. And so Father George Lemaitre shows us that, again, if we measure, if we look at science, it's not an impediment to God, but really, well, we know God, we call God creator, God put everything to being, but how? If we look at religion as the why, science is the how. Science doesn't do what religion does because science isn't developed to, or its purpose, its goal is not to discover why, but how something happens. And the same thing with religion. Religion doesn't look at how things occur, but why? What is our purpose? And so Father George Lemaitre finds a good kind of medium. Let's look at how things occurred. How did the universe come into being through science? And so that can better have an understanding of the why. Why are we here? Because of God. Last two individuals I want to look at, more modern day individuals. Sister Miriam Stimson, probably someone you've never heard of. She was an Adrian Dominican nun, which is a specific religious community that takes after St. Dominic. And she was a chemistry professor. Imagine that. Imagine walking into your chemistry classroom and you have a nun. Maybe you do. Who knows? She was really big in researching and discovering some of the integral foundations of DNA. And to regard the shape of DNA. And I love her story because here she is. We might think of nuns or religious monks or brothers as someone who pray all day and are in their monastery and just pray and have faith in God. Here's a strong woman who not only wanted to learn and teach, but she used her skill sets to come to know the intricacy of us and how wonderfully made we were by God. And that has helped scientific inquiry going forward in terms of an understanding of DNA. So we can use our gifts in search and study, that we can learn about the world scientifically speaking, and that it can only lend to us discovering more of this intricacy of the world and this intricacy of how, uniquely made we are by God. The last individual I want to point out is Guy Cosmolongo. He is a Jesuit priest, a Jesuit brother, which is another religious order founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And he is currently the director of the Vatican Observatory. Yes, that's right. In the Vatican, there is actually an Office of Science, a department, an observatory that actually works in scientific inquiry. So who knew? And really what he does, he still works today, is he engages in different scientific inquiries. He engages in different scientific testing, especially in terms of astronomy and planetary studies. And he has released a lot of different works of what not only advancing science, but really what does it share us about God? And what can we learn about this vastness of the universe in terms of who God is? So hopefully from these 6 individuals that we can see that religion and science are not at odds, and very much there have been people throughout time and history that have used science to actually come to understand this world, and by virtue of that to kind of discover more of who God is. Lastly, I kind of want to finish our time together by looking at 2 main topics, if you will, that sometimes are brought at odds with religion, or at least people make it seem that so, and look at what exactly does the church teach on some of these issues. So the first and probably most popular is this idea of evolution. This idea that we evolved, for lack of a term, between different species or different modes or states of existence to our current state, and that we are currently still evolving, this process of movement. Well, what does the church actually say about this? Well, there's a great article in the Reading, and if you read it, you'll see that it was anything but simple. The church looks at evolution as an evolution, that it is an ongoing theory, and quite frankly, there's several theories of evolution. And so the church ultimately doesn't deny the existence of evolution, but it acknowledges that there are different theories that make genuine efforts to discover how the universe came to be, and that as science is growing and developing evolutionary theory to understand how we came to be, that the church is open to that and thinks it's a good thing. We're going to learn about Genesis in a couple modules, and we're going to see that, at least from a Catholic perspective, the idea of the accounts of creation in Genesis don't conflict with evolution. Genesis, above all, from at least a Catholic perspective, relays and communicates certain truths about existence. It isn't meant to be a scientific account of how the world was made, and Pope Benedict writes about that very well in his book In the Beginning, which he wrote when he was then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. The one thing, though, that the church is very clear about is this: they're open and do not reject evolutionary theory as long as it does not deny the existence of the soul. So one of the things we're going to see with creation is that we are multifaceted beings, that God put us into being with many qualities that have grown. But one of them that is inherent to us is the soul. And we get that from the moment of conception when God will, when we come into being. And so that is an integral part of what the church understands, that we believe, yes, our evolutionary theory is not bad, sure, by all means, but we cannot deny the existence of the soul. It's very essential. Lastly, this issue of climate change. It's something that's definitely been in the media as of late. Different individuals arguing whether it's true or not true. The church, especially Pope Francis in his recent encyclical, an encyclical is a document or letter that the Pope crafts with the help of other theologians, usually on certain issues that he wants to communicate, and it really expands church or adds to church teaching. And Pope Francis in this encyclical writes in part about the issue of needing to care for creation and the issue of climate change. I've asked you to read a couple of paragraphs from his encyclical about what he says about climate change and what we need to respond. As far as the church is concerned, it defers to science, and in the scientific inquiry, again, science looks at the how and religion looks at the why. And what Pope Francis is saying is the scientific inquiry out there right now is saying that climate change is very much an issue that we can't ignore. And so let's look at the why now. Well, why do we need to take care of creation? Why do we need to be concerned with climate change? Because God has called each one of us to be stewards. That means to take care of what's been given to us. So if you think of a butler, a steward who takes care of you at a restaurant, we as humans are called to be stewards and take care of the world that God has given us. Okay, we can't just use it and abuse it as we feel fit. We can't just hoard all the resources for ourselves. We have to make sure that everyone has access to resources. So what the church says is that we most certainly have to take care of the world's resources, that climate change is real, and that in misusing these resources, we contribute to this. So we need to look at real ways to address how the creation, how the world is being affected by our choices. So we can see in these two kind of stances, these two kind of issues, that the church really defers to science and says, well, what is science discovering? What has it found as to how? And then let's look at the why. Well, because we believe what we believe, that we were made into being by God, that we have a certain purpose to know and love God, do good according to God's will, and to be in a relationship with God, and we've discovered that. And God is calling us to live in a relationship with Him, and that's going to ask certain things of us, then that means that we have to take these things seriously, and we have to make genuine choices and decisions that's going to affect the world around us. So really, by learning about the world around us, we learn more about what God asks of us, and we learn more about who we are and how to respond.